Good afternoon. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for a special seminar hosted by the Department of Food and Human Nutritional Sciences at University of Manitoba. My name is Dr. Michel Aliani, and I am a professor in the department, as well as the chair of the FHNS Outreach and Communications Committee. Today, we are very excited to welcome a special guest speaker, Dr. Robert Lustig, a professor emeritus of Pediatrics, Division of Endocrinology, University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Lustig will be speaking on the topic sugar and chronic disease. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojiki, Dakota and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Now, once Dr. Lustig has finished his presentation, he has graciously agreed to answer some questions from today's audience. To pose your question, I invite you to use the Q&A function in Zoom, which is located at the bottom middle of your screen. So please type your question into the Q&A, and please do not type into the chat box. You can type your question in at any time during the seminar. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, and we will combine, of course, similar questions. So I think we have over 600 people registered for today's seminar. So please do not be disappointed if we do not get to every single question. So, and now I would like to introduce you to our guest speaker. So please welcome Dr. Robert Lustig. Dr. Lustig is a neuroendocrinologist with expertise in metabolism, obesity, and nutrition. He is one of the leaders of the current anti-sugar movement that is changing the food industry. Dr. Lustig graduated from MIT in 1976 and received his medical degree from Cornell University Medical College in 1980. He also received his Master's of Studies in Law from Hastings College of the Law, California, so in 2013. He is the author of the popular books Fat Chance, The Hacking of the American Mind, and Metabolical, The Lure and the Lies of Professional Food, Nutrition, and Modern Medicine. He is the Chief Science Officer of the nonprofit Eat Real. He is on the advisory boards of the UC Davis Innovation Institute for Food and Health, the Center for Humane Technology, Simplex Health, Levels Health, and Redoubt Health, and he is the Chief Medical Officer of Biolumen Technologies, Fugal, Perfect, and Calen Health. So with this introduction, Dr. Lustig, thank you again, and the floor is all yours. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Aliani, and I apologize to the audience for my voice. I am now COVID day 7. I'm feeling fine, but unfortunately, a bad case of laryngitis, which happens every time I get a virus. And I apologize. This is, you know, some people think it's sexy, but it is what it is. In any case, let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to talk about what I think is the single biggest problem we have in medicine today, and that is the problem of chronic disease and the cause, which is sugar. Now, you may say to me, why in the world would sugar be the cause of chronic disease? Isn't sugar just calories? And if that were the case, then is calories the real problem? I'm here to tell you that this is a very specific problem having nothing to do with calories, and this has to do with biochemistry. And we're going to address that as we go. So we will talk about the science, and then we will talk about policy, and then, of course, we will talk about politics, which get in the way of any meaningful policy change. That is particularly important as First Nations patients continue to have even more problems than the rest of Canada. And I'll show you some data. So first of all, disclosures. I did write these books for the general public. I am chief medical officer of some companies, a paid advisor to some others. I will not be speaking about any of these companies or products during this talk, and no one is paying me off to, for any of this. I basically just, show you the science. Well, it starts here, and this is not science. This is the fiction. This is what's wrong. Okay, unfortunately, most people believe it. This was a TV commercial on American football in the year 2013, 2-minute video sponsored by Coca-Cola called Coming Together. You can still watch it on YouTube. Please don't right now. But this is a direct quote from that video. Beating obesity will take action by all of us based on one simple common sense fact. All calories count, no matter where they come from, including Coca-Cola and everything else with calories. So you can get your calories from carrots, or you can get your calories from cheesecake, or you can get your calories from Coca-Cola, or you can get your calories from kumquats. It doesn't matter, because it's about energy balance. It's about how much you eat versus how much you burn. Therefore, it's about gluttony and sloth. Therefore, it's about two behaviors. Therefore, if you're fat, it's your fault. Therefore, diet and exercise. Therefore, any calorie can be part of a balanced diet. Therefore, don't pick on our calories, go pick on somebody else's calories. All of these come from the notion that calories are fungible, that one calorie is like any other calorie, and that it is only the sum of these calories that does damage. And after all, it's common sense. This is what the first law of thermodynamics says, sort of, but not really. In fact, when you actually look at the data, the science says that some calories cause disease more than others because different calories are metabolized differently in the body, and some cause very specific liver problems that others don't. And that's because a calorie is not a calorie. Okay, and it very much depends on where those calories come from as to whether or not they cause disease or not. So my agenda for today is the argument. Then we will discuss the dark forces at work to try to keep things the way they are. And finally, the solutions. So let's take the argument first. Chronic disease is a lot of things. So you say, well, if there's so many things, how can they possibly have one or just a few potential underlying structural defects that lead to all of these other ones? And the answer is, well, if they affect the mitochondria, then that's exactly what you would find. And that's exactly what happens here. We have, all of these are the diseases of mitochondrial dysfunction. And you'll notice, if you take a look at all of these diseases listed on this slide, there are no cures for any of these. We have medicines that treat the symptoms of each of these, but we don't actually reverse any of them. And the reason is because there are no medicines that get to the mitochondria, but food does. Food can get to the mitochondria to help it, or food can get to the mitochondria to hurt it. And it turns out sugar goes to the mitochondria specifically to hurt it. Sugar, for lack of a better word, and your own Canadian newspaper put this on its cover, is public enemy number one. And you'll see why in a moment. So you're aware of this, of course, cigarettes addictive and hazardous to your health. There's no argument there, right? Although 40 years ago, no one believed it, but we know it now. My question is this true as well? And I'm going to show you today that this is indeed the case. Now, the public health community agrees that 4 criteria have to be met in order for a substance to qualify for regulation. Number 1, unavoidability or ubiquity. You can't get away from it. Number 2, toxicity, that it causes damage. Number 3, abuse, that is, that people can't stop their consumption. And lastly, number 4, externalities. That is negative impact on society. How does your use affect me? Like for tobacco, secondhand smoke; for alcohol, car accidents, drunk driving. Okay, so it can't be that sugar affects the user. It has to be that sugar affects someone else, all right, in order to then have it be rife for substance control. So let's take each of these in turn. Let's start with ubiquity. Well, here's the growth of the sugar industry here in the 19th century in America. Our ancestors getting fruits and vegetables and the occasional honey out of the ground in 1820 consumed about 5 pounds of sugar per year, which is fine. All right, we ended up coming up here to stabilization when price equaled demand. Here's the rationing of World War II, came back to the same level after World War II. And here's the advent of processed food in the mid-1960s. And of course, since then, we've had the substitution of high fructose corn syrup for sugar. And we've also had the dietary guidelines to, reduce fat, which meant increase the sugar yet again, because, processed food with low fat tastes like cardboard. Well, ultra-processed food now accounts for 56% of the food sold in America. It accounts for 62% of the sugar in the American diet, and it accounts for 67% of the sugar in children's diets. And it's not just in the obvious. It's not just in the sugared beverages. It's not just in the candy cakes and ice cream. Of course, it's there, but it's also in fruits and vegetables, starchy foods and drinks, meat, fish, dairy products, fish, fats and sauces, salty snacks, etc. It's everywhere. Bottom line, every single item in the grocery store has been spiked with added sugar because the food industry knows when they add it, you buy more. And this is particularly true in Canadian Indigenous populations. Here I've put a blue box around Manitoba. And you can see that if you're looking at the amount of ultra-processed food calories consumed, for all regions, it's 1,000. And for Manitoba, it's 1,100. In fact, Manitoba, it's the highest level of all of the provinces for both women and for men. Okay, so Manitoba is a particularly hot spot, and I think you know this. First Nations issues are rife, and we need to address these directly. So let's move now to toxicity. This was an article published about our research at UCSF back in 2011, written by Gary Taubes, called "Is Sugar Toxic?" And this was our Nature comment in 2012 that I wrote with my colleagues from the Institute for Health Policy Studies, Laura Schmidt and Claire Brindis, called "The Toxic Truth About Sugar." So what do I mean by toxicity? Well, right from the dictionary definition, the degree to which a substance can damage an organism. Now notice, it does not distinguish acute from chronic toxicity. So we have acute toxins like cyanide, sarin, ricin, VX gas, parts per billion, keel over and die in a heartbeat. But we also have chronic toxins. For instance, benzene, arsenic, tobacco smoke. Okay, these don't kill you immediately. They take a while, and it may not be one episode. It may be 10,000 episodes that ultimately lead to death. But that's what we've got with sugar. 10,000 episodes, because every meal is dessert. Now, in order for me to show that sugar is a toxin, that is, damages ourselves, humans as an organism, I have to demonstrate 4 requisites. I must demonstrate that it is an independent risk factor, that it is not dependent on its calories, that it is not related to obesity. Otherwise, calories are the problem and obesity is the problem, in which case then the food industry is correct, but they're not. And finally, I must establish causation. Correlation will not do. All right. So there are 3 problems. The first problem, fructose is not glucose. So glucose is the energy of life. Every cell on the planet burns glucose for energy. Glucose is so important that if you don't consume it, your body makes it. But fructose, the sweet molecule in sugar, is not glucose. Fructose is a 5-membered ring. Glucose is a 6-membered ring. They are not the same. They have a completely different biochemical profile and a biochemical clearance mechanism. Fructose is 7 times more likely than glucose to form what are known as advanced glycation end products. I'll show you that in a moment. Fructose does not suppress the hunger hormone ghrelin. So if you drink a soft drink, you're hungrier because the 150 calories in the soft drink didn't actually suppress hunger. Fructose does not stimulate insulin immediately. Therefore, you don't get a leptin rise. And if you don't get a leptin rise, your brain doesn't know you ate. And finally, liver fructose metabolism is completely different from that of glucose. And chronic fructose exposure alone promotes the metabolic syndrome. So first, we're looking at the metabolism of glucose. Notice this is a liver cell. Okay, here's glucose entering the liver cell. Almost all of it gets converted straight to glycogen. Liver starch. This is what your liver wants to do with excess energy. It wants to store it as liver starch. This is why marathoners carb load before a race. All right. Now, very little of it will make its way down to the mitochondria as pyruvate via anaerobic glycolysis, will enter the mitochondria, will then participate in the tricarboxylic acid cycle, generating ATP and carbon dioxide. If there's extra glucose, it will get thrown off as citrate. The citrate will exit the mitochondria through a process known as the citrate shuttle. That citrate will then be acted on by these 3 enzymes: ATP citrate lyase, acetyl-CoA carboxylase 1, fatty acid synthase, to turn citrate first into acetyl-CoA, then into malonyl-CoA, finally into fatty acyl-CoA, which then get packaged with ApoB100 to form very low density lipoproteins, which you measure in your blood as the serum triglyceride. So when you consume glucose, your triglyceride barely moves because pretty much any glucose that entered the liver got stored as glycogen. Now take a look at fructose. Fructose enters the liver. You see glycogen anywhere? No glycogen. Fructose 1-phosphate comes straight down to the mitochondria as pyruvate. And now you've got loads of pyruvate. So you're going to have loads of citrate being thrown off. And these various pathways are all going to stimulate this process here in orange, which we call de novo lipogenesis, these 3 enzymes, de novo, new, lipogenesis, fat making. And so you end up making a lot of fatty acyl-CoA and a lot of triglyceride. This is the hypertriglyceridemia of fructose consumption. Now, some of that fat won't even make it out and will precipitate as a lipid droplet. And now you have fatty liver disease. And when that happens, now you have hepatic insulin resistance, and you also can't phosphorylate the forkhead protein FOXO1 to keep your blood glucose down, so you end up with hyperglycemia. And in addition, the hyperinsulinemia that comes from the insulin resistance blocks leptin, generating increased hunger and therefore continued consumption. So this becomes a vicious cycle. This was not true with glucose. It's true with fructose. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is on this slide. Here are 5 pictures of food. They all share one thing in common. They're all brown. Okay, they're all brown. That's the browning or the Maillard reaction or non-enzymatic glycation. It's why banana's brown. It's why you get cataracts and wrinkles as you get older. So here's how to think about this. Instead of roasting your meat at 375 degrees for an hour, instead, what we do is we roast our meat at 98.6 degrees for 75 years. The answer is the same. We're all browning, and here's proof, because here's newborn rib cartilage, nice and white, and here's 88-year-old rib cartilage, nice and brown. We're all browning as we speak, and if you had orange juice for breakfast this morning, you are browning 7 times faster. The reason this occurs is because the aldehyde group of glucose will bind to the epsilon amino group of lysine in the hemoglobin molecule, form a shift base, which then spontaneously decomposes to form this covalent linkage known as the amidroid product. And this is hemoglobin A1C. Well, this happens in all tissues, not just in hemoglobin. So this is causing, number one, reduction in protein flexibility. And it's also causing the production of reactive oxygen species, because every time this reaction occurs, you get a hydrogen peroxide, you get an oxygen radical. And you can see that glucose will do it or fructose will do it. And when those add up, you end up with cell dysfunction and death. We've shown that every increase of 150 calories per person per day within any country's borders increases diabetes prevalence by a total of 0.1%. But if those 150 calories happen to be a can of soda instead, then diabetes prevalence increases 11-fold, not 0.1, but 1.1%. These data actually meet the criteria for causal medical inference, the Bradford-Hill criteria, the same level of proof that we have for tobacco and lung cancer, the same level of proof we have for football trauma and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, because we showed dose, more sugar, more diabetes, duration, longer sugar exposure, more diabetes, directionality, those countries where sugar went up, more diabetes, those countries where sugar went down, less diabetes. And most importantly, for causation, you have to show precedence, 3 years. Whenever sugar exposure changed in a country, diabetes changed in the same direction 3 years later. We control for all the confounders. Turns out 25% of all the world's diabetes is explained by sugar and sugar alone. We have now done a proof study where we've actually done an intervention. Okay, and these are 3 of the papers that have been published. We now have 5. What we've shown is that we took 43 children from our clinic at UCSF with metabolic syndrome, so obesity plus comorbidities, where they were all had fatty liver and they all had high triglycerides. And what we did was we put them on an isocaloric, fructose-restricted diet for 9 days. We took the sugar out of their diet. And what we did was we substituted starch so that their weight didn't change. What we found was that in 10 days flat, their liver fat went down 22%, their de novo lipogenesis rate went down 46%, their VLDL got cut in half by 49%, their visceral fat went down by 7%, and most importantly, their beta cells in their pancreas started working properly again. We reversed their metabolic syndrome with no change in calories and no change in weight. This has since been corroborated by a group from UC San Diego and Emory University. So this leads me to the question, is ultra-processed food, which of course is high in sugar, food? Well, in order to answer that question, you have to know the definition of food. Well, here it is. Substrate that contributes to either the growth or burning of an organism. Growth or burning. So if any substrate does either one, then it's food. If it does neither, then it's not. Well, let's take burning first. So here are mitochondria. This is where the burning occurs, right? Glucose, as you can see, activates 2 enzymes that increase mitochondrial function. Activates AMP kinase, which is the fuel gauge on the liver cell, actually increases mitochondrial biogenesis. And it also increases this enzyme here called HADH, hydroxyacyl-CoA dehydrogenase. The sum is that beta oxidation in the mitochondria increase. Fructose, on the other hand, actually inhibits 3 separate enzymes. It inhibits AMP kinase. It inhibits ACAD-L, acyl-CoA dehydrogenase long chain, which is one of the steps to beta oxidize. And lastly, it inhibits carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, which is the enzyme regenerating carnitine, which is necessary to shuttle fatty acids into the mitochondria for beta oxidation. So fructose inhibits beta oxidation. Ron Kahn, the head of Joslin Diabetes Center at Harvard, said about this study, the most important takeaway of this study is that high fructose in the diet is bad. It's not bad because it's more calories, but because it has effects on liver metabolism to make it worse at burning fat. As a result, adding fructose to the diet makes the liver store more fat. This is bad for the liver and bad for whole body metabolism. Could not agree more. And this has now been shown in an indirect calorimetry study done at the NIH by Kevin Hall, where he basically gave people ultra-processed food or unprocessed food in varying order, and showed that when controlled for calories, sugar, fat, fiber, and macronutrients, the ultra-processed food caused more food intake and more weight gain than the unprocessed food. Okay, how about growth? So this is work from my colleague, Dr. Efrat Monsenigo Ornan, head of nutrition at Hebrew University, Jerusalem. And what she showed is that here in the control animal, you can see nice cortical bone formation, whereas in the ultra-processed food and caloric soft drink model, you can see that that is completely wiped out. You can see the fading out of this bone compared to control, because the osteopenia. And here you can see the shelling out of the inside of that cortical bone right there. In addition, we also know from studies in France that, in fact, ultra-processed food increase risk for cancer, the hijacking of growth instead. As you can see here, every 10% increase in ultra-processed food led to a 12% increase in cancer. So if ultra-processed food does not contribute to growth and it does not contribute to burning, is it food? In fact, it's not. It's poison. So remember this slide I showed you before? What I'm going to do now is I'm going to overlay on the slide the percent of gross domestic product spent on healthcare in the US for the same period of time. What do you see? When processed food became our most prevalent substrate source, that's when healthcare costs started to climb. Number 3, abuse. Remember, we have 4 to go. Well, National Geographic said it, sugar, why we can't resist it. In fact, food addictions are a real thing, although it's argued. The fact of the matter is we actually have the data to show that, in fact, sugar is specifically addictive. And this is not even new news. It's old news, because any of you who have ever worked in a newborn nursery, you will recognize this. It's called Sweeties. Sweeties, it is a 24% super concentrated sucrose solution that you dip the pacifier in and stick in the newborn boy's mouth before the circumcision, because it induces endogenous opioids in the nucleus accumbens to reduce pain. In fact, fructose and glucose act on different parts of the brain. Glucose acts on the areas of the prefrontal cortex, the executive center, but fructose works on the limbic system, on the ventral striatum and the nucleus accumbens. So you get a very different view. And we actually have an economic version of this. It's called price elasticity. So what price elasticity says is how much consumption changes when the price of a food goes up by 1%. Well, the most price elastic food is eggs. So when the price of eggs go up 1%, people stop eating eggs. So the most price inelastic foods are restaurant food, soft drinks, and juice. So when the price of these foods go up 1%, they barely change. And the reason is addiction. So here are the DSM criteria for addiction. Tolerance, which we've now shown because of the reduction in dopamine receptors in the nucleus accumbens, and either withdrawal or psychologic dependence. And if you read through these, they basically, these are the phenomena that sugar addicts state. And lastly, externalities, negative impacts on society. So what we've done here is we've modeled using fatty liver disease as our sentinel disease. It's a microsimulation model of the changes in fatty liver disease, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, overweight, or obesity that would occur with either a 20% reduction, that would be, say, a soda tax, or a 50% reduction, which would be actually adhering to the USDA guidelines for added sugar. And you can see reductions, very significant reductions across the board. Harvard has since done a similar analysis, and they published this: reducing sugar in packaged foods could prevent disease in millions. And I published this: ultra-processed food, addictive, toxic, and ready for regulation. And lastly, diabetes experts, that's the International Diabetes Federation, tell the G20 to tax sugar to save lives and money. So the G20 is aware, and several countries around the world have actually instituted soda taxes, and I'll have a slide on that later. Having said that, we are meeting the politics of the situation in the dark forces. So let's start with who's saying otherwise. So here's an article that appeared that very specifically attacked me by name. And it said, misconceptions about fructose-containing sugars and their role in the obesity epidemic. Notice, they never talk about diabetes, they only talk about obesity. And the reason is because obesity is the data for fructose and obesity is much weaker, because there are other things that do contribute to weight gain. This is a direct quote from this article. To say that fructose is toxic is a total misconception of the nature of the molecule. If you have too much oxygen, it's toxic. If you get too much water, you have water intoxication. That doesn't mean we say oxygen is toxic. Oh, yes, we do. We say it all the time. In fact, oxygen toxicity is a major problem in the newborn nursery, and that's what retinopathy of prematurity is about. In addition, we have oxygen toxicity in intensive care units, especially during COVID, because of the high incidence of reactive oxygen species from oxygen radicals. So you can know that these people are actually not telling the truth. And in fact, if you look at these three authors, they all take money from industry. Now, let's look at the data on sugared beverage consumption and obesity. So here's the change in sugared beverage consumption from 1987 to 2015. Now, if you look at it, here's what happened. There's been a decrease here in the last 10 years or so. And the reason is because of the obesity epidemic. So people say, well, here's the obesity curve. It's going up. But in the last 10 years, the sugar curve has been going down. So it can't be obesity. They don't correlate here. Well, actually, a group at Knoxville in economics and human biology realized that this is a much more complicated function. And what they did was they looked at a generational time lag, and they looked at basically 2 years in a row instead of 1 year in a row. And they were able to then show that the spline of the modeling actually explained the data in the state of Wisconsin as an example. So in fact, it just so happens that this phenomenon is true and real. It's just a little more complicated than a simple correlation. Another investigator who happens to be Canadian in Toronto by the name of John Sievenpiper published a study where he showed no obvious association between sugar beverages and obesity and diabetes. My colleague, Dean Schillinger at UCSF, took Sievenpiper's paper and reanalyzed it, adding one extra variable, whether a food company sponsored the article. If a food company sponsored the article, 26 out of 26 showed a negative association. Whereas if it was independently funded, 33 out of 34 showed a positive association. What this shows is that the food industry has polluted the literature very specifically, so they can then go back and say, see, no obvious association, data inconclusive. No, the data are very conclusive. And when you look at who's taking that money, there are some very specific people that are taking this money, and they are the ones who are saying it's about calories. In fact, they started a consortium known as the Global Energy Balance Network that was actually sponsored by Coca-Cola and was revealed by the New York Times on Nahat O'Connor to show that Coca-Cola was paying off scientists to basically say that sugar was not a problem for obesity. Those 3 scientists have since lost their jobs. In fact, my colleagues at UCSF, Kristen Carnes, Laura Schmidt, and Stan Glantz, have uncovered the paper trail of the Sugar Research Foundation, because they showed that in 1965, the Sugar Research Foundation approached 3 scientists from the Harvard School of Public Health to publish 2 literature reviews in the New England Journal of Medicine, which singled out fat and cholesterol as the cause of coronary disease and downplayed evidence that sucrose consumption was also a risk factor. So this has been a put-up job from the very beginning. This paper came out in 2013 called Profits and Pandemics. And what it said was that when I went to medical school back in 1980, we had to learn the old medicine, which was about infections, and the vector was microbes, like COVID-19. Today, we have to learn the new medicine, which is about chronic disease, and the vector is instead multinational corporations. And just like microbes, multinational corporations learn resistance. This is from the Credit Suisse, Global Investment Bank, Credit Suisse Research Institute from 2013, a report called Sugar Consumption at a Crossroads. This is a global investment bank who looked at the data with a fresh eye, with no rose-colored glasses. And here's what they said. We believe higher taxation on sugary food and drinks would be the best option to reduce sugar intake and help fund the fast-growing healthcare costs associated with type 2 diabetes and obesity. A global investment bank is calling for sugar taxation. Now, how strange is that? This is from another global investment bank, Morgan Stanley, looking at the rate of GDP growth based on a high sugar model here in gold versus a low sugar model here in blue over the course of the next 20 years. And as you can see, the high sugar model reaches 0.0%. Who's that good for? Okay, so that's the politics. Now, finally, solutions. Unfortunately, because this is a mitochondrial dysfunction, there are no medicines that get to the mitochondria. The only way to solve this problem is reduction in exposure. That means the iron law of public health is at work. And we have the iron law of public health for tobacco and for alcohol. Reducing the availability of a substance will reduce consumption, thereby reducing health harms. So we have 1,500 years of alcohol policy. And alcohol and sugar are very similar because they are metabolized in the liver the same way and by the mitochondria in the same way. They are both ostensibly nutrients, but aside from energy, they have no health value. Metabolic and central pathways are similar. Both are legal substances that produce health harms when overused. There's little danger from moderate consumption, and the burden of harm falls disproportionately on poor people. But we also need to know about tobacco. And the reason is because the food industry acts like the tobacco industry. So tobacco is also important. The burden of harm also falls on the poor. Both tobacco and sugar are mixed with other items, in tobacco's case, menthol, in sugar's case, caffeine, to increase the salience of a product. Both lobby Congress heavily, especially for shield laws in America and also in Canada as well. Both are heavily invested in developing light strategies, and both have invested heavily in marketing to children. So we have to prevent. Well, there are two kinds of prevention. There's targeted prevention, and then there's global prevention. Now, targeted prevention has strengths and it has weaknesses. The strengths are you target the individual. That sounds good. It limits to those who are affected. That leaves the other people out. It's easier to incorporate into medical care. You can medicalize targeted prevention much more easily, like colon cancer. Benefit to risk ratio is high. Those are all good things. But there are weaknesses. Medicalization of prevention really never worked. Behavior modification is notoriously difficult. Costs and feasibility are through the roof. And unfortunately, very limited success. So then we have to look at global health prevention, public health prevention. The strengths are it's radical, powerful, and you modify the environment so that children are not going to be affected. The limitations are acceptability, feasibility, and of course, costs. So what strategies don't work? Because we've tried a lot of things. Okay, the strategies that don't work are the inducements, the carrots, if you will. Okay, there's carrot and there's stick. All right, the carrots don't work. Governmental guidelines don't work. Public information campaigns don't work. School-based education programs don't work. Warning labels on product packaging don't work. Menu labeling hasn't worked. Industry self-regulation has been a disaster. So what can we do? Well, we do have to educate, because you can't enact a public health prevention program unless the public is informed. So the question is, how do you educate? Well, which nutrient? Well, maybe sugar is not the right nutrient, although I think it is. Food labeling, how do you do it? Okay, we've been trying to do it, but we haven't done a very good job of it. And part of it's because it's the food label actually hides the effects. And we can talk about that later. Education alone has not solved any substance of abuse. Did Nancy Reagan's just say no work? We had an opioid crisis. Menu labeling hadn't worked in New York City. It turns out education is necessary, but not sufficient. We've talked here in California about adding a warning label to a can of soda. This was the mock-up. Drinking beverages with added sugars contributes to obesity, diabetes, and tooth decay. Now, this was killed in committee 3 times. They've given up since, all right? And the reason? The food industry lobbied the health committee of the state of California's Senate. So what can we do? Well, menu labeling, 2007, 2009, before, after labeling. Mean calories did not change. 3 chains showed a small decrease, and only 15% of respondents reported using the calorie information. When you turn to children, it was even worse. 69% accompanied by parent, 90% from racial and ethnic minority groups. No statistical difference in anything. 35% reported eating fast food pretty much every day. 57% noticing the calorie labels. 9% said they considered the information. 72% reported taste was the most important factor in their meal selection. Indeed, because sugar is sweet. So education alone has not solved any substance of abuse. That's not good enough. Nonetheless, education is how you soften the playing field. And the food industry has actually done my work for me. So this is called IFIC, the International Food Information Council. This is the public relations arm of the food industry. And this comes from 2018. And this is from Food Navigator, a trade magazine. Dr. Robert Lustig's mantra, that not all calories were created equal appears to be resonating with more US consumers, with 1/3 of Americans believing sugars are the source of calories most likely to cause weight gain, compared with just 11% in 7 years earlier, according to a new survey. And here is that survey. So here's what they said. What calories are most likely to cause weight gain? And in 2011, 11% said sugars. Okay, but 64% said all the same or don't know. And what you can see is by 2018, a 38% increase in people who said sugar and refined carbs, and a 42% reduction in people who said all the same and I don't know. In other words, we trained these people in 7 years to recognize that sugar and refined carbs were the primary drivers of obesity. More people now know calorie is not a calorie and that processed food is the problem. Okay, so what does work? Well, the stick, taxation, restriction of access, interdiction we're not going to talk about because we're not going to have ice cream, soda, speakeasies. We ultimately have to come to peaceful coexistence with sugar in the same way that we've had to come to peaceful coexistence with tobacco and alcohol. Taxation and restriction of access are actionable, and I'll show you data for both. What is likely to work? Pricing strategies, controls at the point of sales, bundling strategies, which are actually probably the best way, and finally, government agency action. So pricing. So first of all, you already have a general services tax, as Europe has a value-added tax. So you're already paying for sugar, which is good. That's one of the reasons why you are less obese in America, for just that reason. As I've told you, price elasticity is a big problem. Only a 10% price increase will only reduce consumption by 2%. But my colleague Mike Rayner in Oxford showed that if you institute a 20% tax, you can actually reduce consumption by significantly more. That's when the pain starts, and that's when you can actually get reduction in consumption. Small taxes will generate money for programs, but that's not the issue. The issue is consumption. So do you tax the ingredient or do you tax the product? Do you do an excise tax or do you do a gram for gram tax? These are big questions and no one knows the answer to those yet. Berkeley did it. We had a whole thing called Berkeley versus Big Soda. UK did it, and that is still in existence, even with Boris Johnson. Okay, World Health Organization agrees on a tax on sugary food and drinks. I went to Mexico to do the exact same thing. And in fact, Mexico passed a soda tax in 2013. We ultimately passed a soda tax here in San Francisco. But the first time we tried to do it, what the food industry painted it was as a grocery tax instead of a soda tax, right? Berkeley did do it. San Francisco ultimately did it 2 years later. And you can see the change in sugared beverages in Berkeley compared to the control. And you can see the increase in water in Berkeley compared to control. So now 6 cities around America have soda taxes, and 28 countries around the world have soda taxes. And what you have to do is you have to monitor the efficacy to demonstrate its efficacy, that it's working. And that's what's happened in Mexico. You can see that the change in soda consumption in Mexico was significant. A 10% tax reduced consumption by 6%. And the reason for that is the price elasticity issue, the addiction issue. So AFAC, the food industry in Mexico said, see, it doesn't work because a 10% tax, they said, should have reduced consumption by 10%. 6% wasn't good enough for them. Well, of course, they were trying to overturn it. The fact is, it's still in place today. And Berkeley has shown, again, durability of the tax here as well. And Philadelphia has also shown the change in consumption with the tax, a 38% net reduction. Okay, how about restriction of access? At UCSF, we said, we need to put our money where our mouth is. We know sugar's toxic. We need to get sugar beverages off campus. And so we passed the Healthy Beverage Initiative in 2015. We have a university-wide sales ban of all sugared beverages and have had it since 2015. And what you can see, we studied it. We showed that, in fact, consumption went down by half and stayed that way. And in addition, waist circumference went down and sagittal diameter went down, and insulin sensitivity improved. As you can see, cholesterol went down, insulin went down, HOMA went down. So we are making our employees healthier by keeping sodas out of the cafeteria and out of vending machines. This has now been shown to be cost effective in a microsimulation model. And it's very similar to what happened in England when they realized that hypertension was killing more Brits. And so the Blair government actually went to the various processed food companies in Britain, like Marks and Spencer and Tesco and Waitrose, et cetera, and said, you're all going to reduce salt across the board, and you're going to do it under our eye, and you're all going to play so that there's no competitive advantage. And they were able to wean salt by 10% per year over 5 years. And what they were able to show was a 40% reduction in blood pressure, stroke, and ischemic heart disease over that period of time. So being able to induce a global intervention has major effects on improving health and longevity. Finally, that's the stick. Now, how about the carrot and the stick? Well, that's called bundling. And that's been done once before in the Nordic countries. What they did, they had a problem with alcohol consumption, huge problem with alcohol consumption. They were losing money on both sides of the ledger. Due to decreased productivity, people calling in on their benders, and also cirrhosis of the liver and car accidents. And so in 1977, they passed 2 pieces of legislation that were yoked together. The first was they nationalized the liquor stores so that all liquor stores sold the same fare at the same price. So you couldn't go someplace else and buy it cheaper. The second piece of legislation was they taxed high alcohol spirits, and they used the money from the tax to subsidize low alcohol beer. So a zero-sum game for the countries, but what they were able to do was nudge people away from spirits and toward low alcohol beer. And they showed that consumption of alcohol went down over the course of the next 20 years. And those are still in place today. Could you do that, say, with water? Okay, why don't you tax soda and use the money from the tax to subsidize bottled water? Beverage companies still makes both. All right, they don't care what they sell as long as they sell. So why don't you tax the soda and subsidize the water, and everybody will drink less soda? Okay. Lastly, the question of subsidies. Okay, subsidies distort the market. And what do we subsidize? Corn, wheat, soy, sugar. So people say, well, if you got rid of the subsidies, then the price of food would go up. That's not true. Turns out only 2 items would go up: corn and sugar. Those are the only 2. And that's what we want to go up in order to reduce consumption. So in fact, the price of food would not go up. So bottom line, there's a toxin in our environment, and it was placed there by the food industry. And your population in Manitoba is getting sick and dying because of it. And it will not get better until somebody does something about it. I've given you now the reasons for policy change and also the political problems that go along with it. If the University of Manitoba would like to consider getting sugared beverages off campus, we actually will help you. We have a toolkit that will help you be able to do this. We have done this for about 8 hospitals around the country now, and we can do that for you. My colleagues here, the UCSF Sugar Hill Gang in particular, Laura Schmidt has been directing this effort. And my colleagues at UCSF Hastings College of the Law and UCLA Resnick Center for Food Policy and Obesity are all on board in terms of being able to try to mitigate the damage caused by processed food. So with that, I'll stop my share. And with whatever time left, Professor Aliani, I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lustig, for that very interesting presentation. So really appreciate it. So with that, so I can look at the Q&A questions, so maybe ask a few questions if you don't mind to answer some of them.
Please.
So there are, let's just see, wow, a lot of questions. Let me just see in order. One question was related to fructose. And the question's asking whether the fructose coming from the natural foods, whether it behaves differently at the cellular level compared to what you explained.
So the answer is the fructose molecule is the same, but the difference is that whole fruit has fiber. The fiber mitigates the absorption, and it does so in several different ways, but you need both soluble and insoluble fiber. Soluble fiber is like pectins or inulin, like what holds jelly together. Insoluble fiber is like cardboard, okay, the stringy stuff in celery. All right, you need both. Whole fruit has both. When you consume a piece of fruit, like an orange, what will happen is that the cellulose in the orange will form a lattice work, like a fishnet on the inside of the intestine. And then the soluble fiber, the pectins and the inulin, they're globular. They will plug the holes in the fishnet, and together they will form a secondary, impenetrable secondary barrier that inhibits early absorption of fructose so that it doesn't end up in the liver, doesn't get turned into fat, and doesn't induce insulin resistance. And if it doesn't get absorbed early, then it goes further down the intestine and the bacteria will chew it up for its purposes. So even though it passed your lips, even though you ate it, you didn't get it because you didn't absorb it. And so you actually reduce your exposure because you consumed the sugar with its inherent fiber. The bottom line is fruit is good, juice is bad.
Very good, thank you. So following up with the fructose, because there's another question related to what about the development of fructokinase inhibitors, which are apparently in the research phase?
Yes, that's a great question. And Rick Johnson at the University of Colorado, Denver is working on this, very, very, as fast as he can. Now, I've talked with Rick about this, and it's actually in his book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, which actually came out about a month ago. I actually gave him a quote for that book. And Rick is a great, great scientist. There's no doubt that fructokinase inhibition means that the liver will not turn that fructose into fat. It protects the liver. The question is that fructose has other effects elsewhere because of the effects that I talked about in terms of the Maillard reaction and in terms of some other effects that it has that we didn't discuss. So I've asked Rick about those and whether or not fructokinase inhibitors will help those. And he doesn't know the answer to that yet. We will have to wait until fructokinase inhibitors are developed. He's still working on those, and whether they will make it through clinical trials. In any case, they're at least 10 years off.
10 years. Okay, thank you. So I just see a few questions related to artificial sweeteners. Okay, so what is they just ask, what's your thoughts about artificial sweeteners with respect to effect on metabolism?
Right. So artificial sweeteners are no fructose, no calories. Should be good, right? Except they're not. The data on artificial sweeteners, and I've just reviewed this for a journal, shows half as bad. The toxicity of one Coca-Cola equals the toxicity of 2 Diet Coca-Colas. Now, that doesn't make it good, but it's half as bad. Now, you say, but no fructose, no calories. How can it be toxic? The answer is, you put something sweet on the tongue. Message tongue to brain, sugar's coming. Brain to pancreas, sugar's coming, release the insulin. And you end up releasing more insulin anyway. This has been shown now in several studies. So that insulin is what drives the weight gain, and actually it's what drives chronic disease. So you're not getting away from the hyperinsulinemia, number one. Number two, an abstract just appeared like yesterday at the experimental biology meeting showing that artificial sweeteners, in particular sucralose and aspartame, actually inhibit P-glycoprotein, which is necessary for detoxification of various things that are necessary to prevent liver fibrosis. And it may be one of the reasons for NAFLD. And also, it turns out adipose tissue has receptors for diet sweeteners right on them, and they cause energy deposition into fat directly without insulin. So if you absorb those artificial sweeteners, you might be affecting energy deposition all by itself, irrespective of the calories. So turns out diet sweeteners are not the panacea.
Very good. Okay, so I have a question, a general question. So what would be your best step to advise a patient to start reducing sugar in their diet?
Right. All right. So that's a very loaded question, and it depends on who the patient is. Is it a kid or is it a parent? Okay. Is it a young person or an old person? Is it a poor person or is it a rich person? You know, there are a lot of, whys and wherefores. Let me give you my script. Okay. And this will work very well in Canada, I think, especially in First Nations. And I'll explain why in a minute. You're probably aware that patients with severe insulin resistance, as do First Nations and our African-American population here in the United States, have very significant acanthosis nigricans, the stuff on the back of the neck, the hyperpigmentation and the ridging. That is insulin working on the skin. That's insulin working on the epidermal growth factor receptor of the skin. So what I would do in clinic is I would call the mother over and I'd say, Mom, come over here, take a look at your kid's back of your neck. And they say, oh yeah, that's ring around the collar. I go, no, it's not. Has it ever come off? She says, no. I say, you've tried to scrub it off, right? No. Okay, that's not ring around the collar. And then what I would do is I would go to my computer and I would actually type in acanthosis into Google Images. And I'd bring up, this whole, panoply of images showing acanthosis on the back of the neck and in the underarms and behind the knee, et cetera. I go, this is what your kid has. This is insulin working on the skin. So I haven't even drawn your kid's insulin level, and I already know the kid's insulin level's high. So here's what's happening. Kid's insulin's high. You eat straight to fat. Bigger, 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 every day bigger. And you can't stop it. The only way to stop it is to get the insulin down. So how do you get insulin down, lady? She says, I don't know. Well, don't let it go up. So what makes insulin go up? Only two things: refined carbohydrate and sugar. And so I've already taken a history, of what the kid eats. I go, well, here's the refined carbohydrate and sugar and what your kid eats. You already told me about it. And so by doing that, I've basically, provided her with a cognitive and a visceral response that makes her basically want to partner with me to solve a problem that's out, that she now understands is within her control. And I found that that's a very effective way of motivating patients. Not society, but patients.
Very good. Thank you. So there is a question I see related to glycemic index and glycemic load.
Yes.
And then they're asking, do we need to look at glycemic load or glycemic index?
The glycemic index is a piece of crap. Okay? Just throw it in the friggin' garbage. Okay. Glycemic index is flawed. Okay. It is flawed two ways. Two ways. The first way it's flawed is explained by carrots. Okay. Now, carrots have a high glycemic index, a glycemic index of 96. That's high. So if you eat 50 grams of carbohydrate in carrots, your blood glucose will go pretty high. But glycemic load is how many carrots do you have to eat to get 50 grams of carbohydrate? And the answer is you have to eat 700 grams of carrots. You have to eat 1.4 pounds of carrots. You have to eat the whole friggin' Grimway truck. All right? No one can do it. You turn orange first. All right? So carrots are self-limiting because of the fiber. And the fiber is what limits the problem of the glycemic excursion in carrots. So carrots have a low glycemic load because you can't eat that many carrots. So that's issue number one. Glycemic load matters, glycemic index doesn't. The second reason glycemic index is a canard and garbage is fructose, because fructose is low glycemic index. Fructose doesn't raise the serum glucose, it raises the serum fructose, which is 7 times worse because it engages in that Maillard reaction way more than glucose ever did. And that Maillard reaction is causing damage unrelated to glycemic index. So throw glycemic index in the toilet. Okay, real food is low glycemic load food. All food is low glycemic load food until the food industry, processes it. Then it becomes high glycemic load food.
Thank you. This question, I think, is policy related. So here in Manitoba and some indigenous communities, there is still unreliable drinking water, and these populations often have lower incomes. Additionally, there is low trust of settlers and the decisions made for indigenous communities without their input. What intervention policy tools would be most beneficial in these communities, according to you?
It's a really good question. I will tell you that I was the keynote lecturer this past year in November for National Indigenous Diabetes Awareness Day in November for First Nations Canada, and where I basically gave almost this exact same talk, a little bit, shall we say, less scientific, but, demonstrating these same issues. The bottom line is that the elders need to understand how they're putting their own population at risk. Now, it is true that the water supply is a problem, and I don't argue that. Obviously, efforts need to be made to try to improve the water supply. That's been done in Mexico. Mexico always had the worst water. Now they actually have pretty good water. Canada could do the same. And then there's bottled water. And then remember, the beverage industry makes the bottled water. They don't care what they sell. So this ends up not being a hydration issue. This ends up being an addiction issue. And so the elders have to actually, deal with the, issue of addiction. And addiction is rampant amongst First Nation populations already. And so the question is, if you got rid of the sugar, would it make the cocaine or the heroin use worse? That is a potential question, but it's a question that needs to be addressed as a community, for the entire First Nations, along with the government of Canada. I would be very, very happy to serve as a consultant on, trying to address this question so that it's all out in front, so that people can address the question directly.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. So this question, I think, is related to what you mentioned about the orange juice and breakfast. So what about homemade juices, blended fruits with no sugar added? Is it equally as bad as what is bought on the market?
As soon as you juice the fruit, it's a soda. That's what it comes down to. In fact, soda is 1.7 grams of fructose per ounce. Juice is 1.8 grams of fructose per ounce. So it's actually got a higher fructose density even than soda does. Now, it's true you drink less juice, but not by much. And some kids drink a gallon of it because WIC, women, infants, children here in America give it to them. So juice is just as dangerous as soda. And as soon as you've juiced the fruit, you've taken away that insoluble fiber. So you can't form that lattice work. You can't do that gel. You can't prevent the absorption like I talked about before. So it becomes just as much of a problem, if not more so.
Very good. So we have a question about natural sweeteners like honey, maple syrup. Are they fructose also?
Yes, they're sucrose. They're honey, maple syrup, agave, all the same. Now, they all have their own flavor, and they all are more expensive than sugar. So people tend to use less of them, and anything that causes you to use less of them is good. However, gram for gram, ounce for ounce, calorie for calorie, molecule for molecule, they're the same. No difference.
So we have a question. So just saying, my daughter is 20-year-old and recently diagnosed as having lupus. Would cutting sugar intake be the first step to reverse the autoimmune disease?
As it turns out, there was a paper that appeared in Nutrients in 2020 showing exactly that reducing sugar consumption improved the symptomatology of patients with systemic lupus. So that is a very good thing to do. Why would that be the case? Well, the answer is because fructose in the gut, and this is stuff I didn't have time to talk about, fructose in the intestine inhibits the tight junctions that keep the intestinal epithelial cells tight. And so what happens is they part transiently, and this is the phenomenon known as leaky gut. And leaky gut allows lipopolysaccharides and cytokines and whole bacteria to basically go from the intestinal lumen into the bloodstream. And that increases systemic inflammation, which then makes lupus that much worse. And so by making the gut heal and by making those tight junctions tight, by not poisoning those tight junctions, you can actually improve the symptomatology of many autoimmune diseases by getting rid of sugar. This has been shown for ankylosing spondylitis, and it's been shown for rheumatoid arthritis, and it's been shown for lupus.
Thank you. And so there is another question regarding wound healing and sugar effect. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I'm not going to specifically talk about fructose and wound healing, but diabetes and wound healing is a disaster, as you know, because the bacteria in the wound love the glucose. So you got to keep the blood glucose down, and you got to keep the patient insulin sensitive. So anything that makes the patient insulin resistant is going to make wound healing worse. And sugar makes insulin resistance.
There is a question, they just say that you discuss soda, but what about other beverages with lots of sugars, fructoses, example, coffee products?
Of course, they're the same. It's all the same. Frappuccinos, same thing. No difference.
Very good.
Sugar, it's called sugar sweetened beverages. It's not called sodas per se. We tend to use soda as the offhand, it comes off the tongue easier, but it's SSBs.
So there's a question, people really like sweet foods. Me too. I have had patients say they don't take sugar, but they use honey, syrup, etc., maple syrup and other natural sweeteners that don't say sugar on it per se, okay? What is your advice? Secondly, what is your advice on sugar alcohols?
Right. So sugar alcohols are going to be like the non-nutritive sweeteners. And the thing about sugar alcohols is that they are osmolytes. So if they only have about 1/4 the sweetness of sugar. So you have to use a lot of them to get any meaningful sweetness. And the problem is, since they're metabolized in the gut, they're not, you don't absorb them, but they are metabolized by the gut. and they're act as osmolytes. They hold on to water, and they end up causing a significant GI distress, bloating, diarrhea. Bottom line is, if you use enough of them, you're going to be kind of sick to your stomach. For a hard candy, it's probably fine. But, if you're going to bake with erythritol, I got birch to sell you.
Very good. There is a question, interesting question. Is there any amount of sugar / fructose per day that you consider to be moderate?
Yeah. So the American Heart Association years ago, back in 2009, and I was a co-author on this paper, said that for adult women, 6 teaspoons per day. For adult men, 9 teaspoons per day. So that's 25 and 37.5 grams per day. And for children, 3 teaspoons per day. That's 12 grams. And for under 2 toddlers, 0 grams. And I think that's correct. I still think that's correct.
This is a good question. I think your answer will help many people. So I am a new registered dietitian working with First Nation people in Canada. I wonder if there are good resources on patient education that I can use, or background reading for myself.
Well, so you can start with this. That's one. My other book, Fat Chance, is about this as well. If you go onto my website, robertlustig.com, I have several infographics. So that's one resource. A second resource is curated by UCSF, is called sugarscience.org, sugarscience.org. And we basically have curated 8,000 clinical research articles into 5 messages for the general public. And you can print out a whole bunch of infographics for yourself straight from that website and hand them to your patients. And they've been shown to be very effective in terms of educating. So those are 2, easy resources for you. In addition, there's a movie called Fed Up, which is very worthwhile, from 2014. And there's another one that's Canadian from 2015 called Sugar Coated. Fed Up tells us how we got to where we are today, and Sugar Coated tells us why we got to where we are today in terms of the corporate subterfuge.
Very good. One question is, I get this question often. So I find the flavored sparkling water to taste sweet, despite not sugar being in it, at least the label says, or artificial sweeteners. Would the pancreas be releasing insulin in this case?
That's actually been looked at, and there is a little bit of an insulin response to carbonated beverages just by itself. And I know what you're talking about. It does seem to somehow, shall we say, fool the sweet taste receptor. So you do get an insulin response, but it's much, much lower. So, I mean, full disclosure, I drink, non-caloric sparkling water too.
Okay, so another policy question. So you propose that taxing sugar sweetened items would reduce the amount of consumption. Wouldn't the taxing of these items create an unintended effect of making it more challenging for those of lower socioeconomic status to access these items?
So everybody says, hey, how can you do that? That's regressive against the poor. You know what's more regressive against the poor? Diabetes. Okay, diabetes costs the poor way more than the soda does. Now, what you can do to offset that is, just like I said, do the bundling. Make the water cheaper, or make the water free. All right, and then nothing's regressive, and use the money to sponsor the water consumption. So what you're doing is you're nudging people away from the soda and to the water, and you're not depriving them of anything. So as far as I'm concerned, that whole regressive argument is a tempest in a teapot, and really one that is basically promulgated by the food industry specifically to be, problematic.
Okay, so we have a question from one of our undergraduate students. How do you stay grounded? And do you have any wisdom for an undergraduate student who can get discouraged amidst the incongruent information in class as we pursue our degrees versus information in the wider environment?
How do I stay grounded? I have a wife who yells at me. That's how I stay grounded. When you say stay grounded, the question is, how long does it take to fix a societal problem? So in the last 30 years in America, we have had four cultural tectonic shifts here in America, and you've had them in Canada too. So let me name them for you. Ready? 1, bicycle helmets and seatbelts. 2, smoking in public places. 3, drunk driving. 4, condoms in bathrooms. 30 years ago, if some legislator stood up in a state house or Congress or Parliament, in Ottawa or or in Europe or wherever, and proposed any one of these, legislation for any one of these 4 things, they'd have gotten laughed right out of town. Nanny state, liberty interest, get out of my kitchen, get out of my bathroom, get out of my car. Right? Today, they're all facts of life. No one's belly aching about any of those things. Now, there are new things to bellyache about, like vaccine mandates, but those 4, they're solved, they're settled. Right? And if you pull out of your driveway and you haven't clicked your seatbelt, your kids will scream at you. Now, why is that? How'd that happen? And why did it take 30 years? Answer, we taught the children grew up and they voted, and the naysayers are dead. That's why this is a generational shift. Well, same thing's happening with food right now. And it will be happening with other things too, that are coming down the pike, like, for instance, screens and climate change. All right. These are generational shifts. We're about 9 years into the food one right now out of 30. So the bottom line is, I stay grounded by realizing this is going to outlive me. I'm not going to solve this. All right? Because, it takes a while. I'm just a cog in the wheel. I'm just part of the movement, to make this happen over time. And I'm comfortable with that. And, anyone who participates in public health as a goal has to be comfortable with that. If the goal is credit, forget it. That's not what it's about. It's about fixing a problem. So that's what keeps me grounded.
Very good. So maybe one last question, because I don't want to keep you all day, is just do fasting help accelerate reversing metabolic syndrome?
So I think you mean intermittent fasting.
Yes.
What you mean? Yeah. So intermittent fasting seems to have benefits. Now the question is why? The main reason intermittent fasting works, and it does work, and there are many studies on it, and people are doing it. The main reason that intermittent fasting works is because it gives the liver a chance to burn off the fat it accumulated from the meals before, thereby keeping your liver insulin sensitive. And that's the goal. Now, if you ate real food, you wouldn't have to burn off the liver fat because it wouldn't have formed in the first place. So intermittent fasting is a way of remediating metabolic syndrome. But the goal is never to get to metabolic syndrome. The goal is to eat real food so that you can have a liver that's healthy all the time. So if you're sick, yes, intermittent fasting is a way to do it. If you're healthy, you don't need to intermittently fast because you don't have the liver fat that's worrisome. Okay, so you don't need to do that. You just need to eat real food.
Okay, so there were just a lot of questions in terms of, is this event recorded? Yes, it has been recorded, and Dr. Lustig allowed us to share a link after that. So you will all receive an email with a link so you can actually watch the video again. The last thing is that they are asking whether we are going to share the slides, your slides. So will you? That I leave it with Dr. Lustig.
Professor Aliani, I'll be happy to send you the slides for this talk. There's nothing proprietary in any of them. So I will send you the slides. I will send them as a PDF.
Perfect. Perfect. Then as soon as we receive them, just for everybody who asked that, so we will make it available to whoever wishes to have a copy. So unfortunately, we are out of time today, but I really want to thank Dr. Lustig once again for his presentation and for staying longer and answering all these questions. We really appreciate your presence and your presentation. And hopefully, as you suggested, you can work with Canadian authorities and especially in Manitoba, so to try to find some solutions in the near future.
It would be my pleasure and honor.
Okay, and thanks to everybody who attended. Thank you so much again, and all the best. Have a good evening, everybody.